You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Satellite. I'm having a lot of fun today with all these producers coming in and out, learning things. Very wise people. They're so wise, they know what anarchism is all about. Anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to make the earth tremble? No, it's not orgasm. It's a concentration of power and wealth. So the anarchist struggles, the struggle to devolve or share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good, the Commonwealth of Australia. I know it's a horrible thing to think about, that we actually use the Commonwealth for the common good. So if you're interested in those concepts, keep listening. If you're not, well, there's plenty of things to do in life. Now, my name's Joseph Lascano. I'm hosting this program. It's broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. That's right, the Community Radio Network. So wherever you are in Australia, if you're in one of those areas where you are facing a disaster, a natural disaster, or we should say a man-made natural disaster or a human-made natural disaster, it's fires or floods or cyclones, well, we send you our best. That's all we can do, is send you our best. But the important thing is, make sure you claim everything you're entitled to. Make sure you do that. Don't let them get away with not compensating you for the situation you find yourself in. And if you think that the climate emergency is a hoax and you live in one of these areas, maybe it's time to reconsider your ideas and break out of the silo you find yourself in. So let's move on. Now, you know that I've been describing the President of the United States of America as a buffoon, because I refuse to use the name, all right, because it's polluting the atmosphere. It's verbal pollution, not real pollution, just verbal pollution. So he's a buffoon, all right? So I've decided we really need to extend that, because the man's actions remind me of the late, great Benito Mussolini, who found himself in a sticky end in 1943. That's right, the partisans executed him by hanging him. Hanging him upside down. So, it's these grandiose schemes. But what I'm concerned about is the fact that nobody seems to be standing up, well, in the West at least, standing up to the buffoon. So I think to make it a little bit clearer regarding his strategy, I think from now on, you can call him whatever you like, but I will call him Buffolini. That's right, Buffolini. buffoon, Mussolini, Buffolini. So when I use the word Buffolini, I'm talking about the President of the United States of America. Now, Buffolini has made some extraordinarily outrageous comments, even by his standards. Quite extraordinary, but look, I don't particularly care regarding his outrageous comments, although they do have possible real life consequences for millions of people. But the people of America, the United States of America, elected him. He's their president. But I do find it offensive that our leaders, political, social, cultural, people who set themselves up as our leaders, economic, are too scared, too frightened to stand up to Buffolini. Too scared, too frightened, running scared. Now, if the Premier of China said, we're sick and tired of these Uyghurs, let's deport them to Bhutan, the Western world would be up in arms. It's horrendous, which it is. It's a horrible thing to do. It's inhumane. It tramples every human right. It's ethnic cleansing of the worst degree. But when Buffolini says the 2 million people who've been living in Gaza for generations, and not forget the area of Gaza has been inhabited continuously for over 6,000 years. It was one of the first major urban centres in the world. When he says, well, let's get rid of these people, let's send them to Egypt and Jordan because I've got a lot of economic power as far as Egypt and Jordan is concerned, and if they don't do the right thing, we'll pull the financial lifeline to these regimes. The Jordanian royal family and the military, pseudo-military government in Egypt. And what do our leaders say? Creative thinking. He thinks outside the box. Ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing. And you listen, and I'll talk about this later on in the program. When you listen to the government guild at ABC, they talk about the Hamas wall. They talk about, the president or the General Secretary of the United Nations calls it ethnic cleansing. Nobody's willing to call a spade because they're shit scared of Buffolini. Shit scared. These are theoretically our leaders who are in these positions of leadership to look after our interests as Australians. But when it comes to Buffolini, they run away. They hide in the shadows. They don't open their mouths at these most outrageous statements. Another outrageous statement, if they don't turn over those 3 hostages by midday on Saturday, all hell will break loose. Come on. These are people who are living in rubble in the Gaza. Rubble. Over 45,000 dead, the majority of women and children. Those of you who, watch TV or go on social media, you can see that Hamas is still there 16 months later. And our leaders run away. I'll give you another example, this bullshit about the 25% tariff on steel production. Now, our exports, let's look at it closely. Okay? We export less of our goods and agricultural products in the United States than we import from the United States. The ratio is 2 to 1, all right? 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1 in their favour, okay? Right? Trumpolini says we'll put 25% tariffs on steel, to build up our own steel industry, all right? Fair enough. And we wobble at the knees. Let's not forget, they need us. We don't need them. Think about it. We somehow think in this country that we need Uncle Sam to wipe our bum and put our nappies on every morning. And possibly in the afternoon if we shit ourselves in the afternoon, which you tend to do when Buffalini opens his mouth. Let's look at it. Why does the United States of America need Australia? And who would suffer if we stood up? It wouldn't be us. The first thing is the trade imbalance in favour of the United States of America. The second thing is the importance of United States bases in this country, which are used and continue to be used to conduct war around the world. The third thing is the increasing integration of Australia's military, especially its military hardware, as we see with AUKUS, with the United States military industrial complex. So we pay them to build shit, which we think we need. And lastly, the large number of United States troops which are stationed in Northern Australia, over 3,000 at any time. They need us, because nobody else in our part of the world is stupid enough to think that the United States of America would protect this country if it didn't suit their commercial, political, cultural interests. They have much more to lose than we do. So instead of a grovelling, that's right, grovelling, kowtowing to Buffalini every time he opens his mouth, isn't it about time we stood up? Aren't we a sovereign nation state? Aren't our political representatives elected by us to represent the interests of the country and protect the people of this country? Or are we here to act as an afterthought to the United States of America? So if the bastard wants to introduce, my apologies, if Buffalini wants to introduce a 25% steel tariff, so be it. We'll introduce a 50% tariff for any American imports. Other people around the globe make shit. Other people around the globe buy stuff. And as far as our economic interests are concerned, and even our, military interests are concerned, they are not enmeshed in United States, their interests. As Buffalini says, America first. As we see, he thinks that by pulling the money lever, the trade lever, that somehow everybody will fall to their knees and worship Buffalini and his policies. The fact is, if you really want to have a laugh, remember a few days ago Buffalini was going to call the Chinese Premier and have a chat? Well, the Chinese Premier doesn't want to talk to him at the minute. Maybe they're standing up to Buffalini, unlike here in this country. So it's a matter of pride. To me, it's a matter of personal pride. Am I an Australian citizen? And I am a member of a sovereign nation state? Is this country formed to look after the interests of the people in this country, including, obviously, First Nations people who are the first inhabitants? Or are we just an appendage to the United States? Because if you look at the history of the United States over the last few decades, when it suits the United States to be militarily involved, it is. And when it doesn't suit them, it cuts and runs. Look at the situation in Afghanistan and Vietnam and other parts of the world. So, look, you either stand up to a dictator or a bully, you either stand up to them or you eat shit. It's that simple. So what do you want to do? Do you want to worship at Bufalini's feet? Because you see, there is strategy to my madness in calling him a buffoon and Bufalini. Because the way you take down people like this is to actually degrade them in the eyes of the general public. Because a buffoon is a buffoon, irrespective of, what they say. I don't care what he looks like. But I do care, now that he's the President of the United States of America, elected by the American people, thank you people, I do care the impact it has on this country. And the fact is that if you don't stand up to this type of political leader, and we're told constantly we need to stand up to the Putins of the world, we need to stand up to the Chinese Premier, we need to stand up to these people, to respect our sovereign nation, But when it comes to the United States of America and Bufalini, it doesn't matter what they have in store for this country, we're happy to lick their anal orifice. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. And if you don't like what you hear, switch off the radio. Now, a little analogy. Now, I broadcast from a tiny community radio station in Melbourne, which has been in existence for almost 50 years. It'll be our 50th anniversary celebrations next year. Now, I am able to say what I say on this program because as a community radio station, we are financially independent. When Bufalini throws his weight around, he's talking about the fact that they finance so many things, and if you pull the finance, they'll come to heel and they'll support American policies. Here at 3CR, we are one of the very few independent, radical media outlets in this country. This program is not only listened to by people in Victoria, it's also listened to by people across Australia via the Community Radio Network. In a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, as soon as you become dependent on government grants or corporate donations or advertising, self-censorship creeps into the discussion, and we'll talk about that, about the corporate-owned media later on. But self-censorship becomes a mechanism of survival because if they cut the umbilical cord, which is full of cash, whatever, or crypto, whatever you like, then that organisation shrivels on the vine. The difference between 3CR and many other, not all, but many other community radio stations is we do not rely on government grants, we do not rely on corporate donations, we do not rely on paid advertising, but we do rely on you, the listener. You. If you want to listen to ideas which never made the grade in the corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC, and you want to a diversity of opinion and you don't march to the same drum beat and Zeke Hale every time, somebody asks you to, well then I am encouraging you, if you can, financially, to become a 3CR listener sponsor. Now, 3CR listener sponsors play an exceptionally important role in 3CR, not just in terms of their financial contributions, and I'll speak about that in a second, but in terms of the listeners get a representative on the board here at 3CR. You think the corporate-owned media gives a shit what its listeners think, as long as they buy the shit that is advertised in the corporate-owned media? Do you think the government-gelded ABC cares what its listeners thinks and will give them, although it's owned by the Australian government, a seat on the board of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation? So if you're a regular listener to the Anarchist World this week, I encourage you during Listener Sponsor Drive to become a listener sponsor. And you can do that right now while you're listening to this program. You can do it in a number of ways. You can ring 039 419 8377. Lou's on the phone waiting for your call. 039 419 8377. Listener sponsorship costs $40 for unwaged, $80 for waged, and if you've got a bit of extra cash, you can throw in some extra cash. Also, you can go to the website 3cr.org.au and you'll find all the information about how to become a listener sponsor online. And if you find yourself in the city of metropolis of Melbourne and you're wandering the streets not knowing what to do, ring the bell at 21 Smith Street, Fitzroy, come in and become a listener sponsor on the spot. So if you want independent radio, if you want to listen to the type of information and opinion that you hear on the Anarchist World this week or any of the other many important programs on Community Radio 3CR, and you want Community 3CR to continue to provide material for the community radio network to all the community radio stations across this country, it doesn't matter where you are in this country, I encourage you to ring during office hours 039 419 8377 and become a listener sponsor. Because I can assure you how I personally approach what's happening in the world today on the Anarchist World this week, you will not hear anywhere else. And it's community radio stations like 3CR that have the courage to buck the trend and not kowtow to those who are increasing their power over us on a day-to-day basis. All right, let's move on. I mean, I put out 52 of these programs every year. And if I go away, which I'll be doing the next 2 weeks, I pre-record them. I don't get paid. I'm a volunteer. I spend time, believe it or not, looking at what's happening in the world today, trying to analyse what's happening in the world today to give you a different type of opinion. So I don't think it's too much to ask for you to become a listener sponsor, become part of the 3CR fabric, and continue to ensure that we have independent community radio across this nation. And if you're listening to this program on another community radio station, why don't you give them a ring and see how you can support them? Because community radio continues, despite social media, despite the corporate-owned media, despite the plethora of digital devices in our community, community radio still plays an important part in fashioning, that's right, a narrative that nobody else is willing to tackle. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano and I'm hosting today's program. Does the means justify the ends? This is the big question anybody involved in political action, whether it's parliamentary or extra-parliamentary, has to ask themselves. Does the means justify the ends? Because sometimes the means that are used to create an end which people aspire to replicates the very inequalities which existed in the previous society. Now, I'm asking this question for one very good reason. 24 hours ago, I saw one of the most disgusting, evil, unethical, immoral situations I've come across on the planet for the last 73 years. Now, irrespective of what you think of the Australian Labor Party and the Albanese-led Labor government, in comparison to the coalition, their policies are a little bit more people-friendly, because obviously they can make changes, but that's a different debate. But yesterday in Parliament, could have been the day before, the coalition attempted to gag the Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, I think the most senior Jewish politician in this country, from actually talking about his own past and anti-Semitism, because it didn't suit their agenda. Because the coalition government, I've made a boo-boo there, the coalition, which is currently in opposition and believes it'll be the next government of this country, the coalition is happy to use any means to obtain political power in order to make their masters, the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, happy, almost orgasmic. And they will use anything to create division and hatred in Australian society. And what happened in Parliament was unforgivable. They're quite happy to politicise anything, in order to promote their ideologically dead agenda. Anything. If it's about bashing First Nations people, tearing up mechanisms to gain local treaties, if it's about using the current rise of anti-Semitism in this country as a political, ploy, if it's bashing people on social security benefits, if it's obfuscating any costings regarding any policies, if it's rolling back any efforts to deal with the climate emergency, despite the increasingly difficult nature of many natural disasters which are occurring in this country, which basically are occurring in regional and rural areas, to a significant degree. So this is going to be a particularly bruising federal election campaign, and I'll speak about that in one of the pre-records I'll be doing the next few days. But the thing is, do you really trust a group of people who are willing to divide the nation on the basis of religion, political opinion, gender, sexual orientation? Are you willing to let these people strut the earth buffoon-like without confronting them, confronting their ideas, confronting their ideological bankruptcy? Because that's what we're heading to, a lowest common denominator election. I've looked at some of their, the three things is cost of living, cost of living. Obviously there's a cost of living crisis, but there is a cost of living crisis because most of the legislation which goes through federal parliament benefits the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the minuscule investment classes we have in this country. Obviously there's a cost of living issue, but you think they're going to be able to tackle it? And the list goes on and on. So does the means justify the ends? Remember how Mr. Abbott blustered his way into power? Negativity ruled the roost? Well, think about it. Think about it. And what's another thing which I find quite extraordinary, well, I don't find it extraordinary, it's what you expect, but the way it has been fine-tuned, I find extraordinary. Now, the corporate-owned media in this country is totally responsible for the mess we find ourselves in the land of milk and honey. Well, the milk and honey seems to go down one road and very little goes down the next road. Think about it. The corporate-owned media has now thrown its full weight behind the coalition's re-election strategy, which you'd expect. And that includes social media. Let's not forget that. A lot of people think social media is this huge independent entity where everybody has free speech. Well, get over it, mate. Social media is very similar to the legacy media. It is owned by a few corporations who set the agenda. You don't follow that, you become disenfranchised from social media, all right? As long as you're able to generate a bit of hatred, a bit of controversy, and get eyes on their advertisements, which means they get more money, they don't give a shit. But as soon as you try to challenge the status quo, look at what's happened on the planet in the last 50 years with the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands, then you will find that your message disappears into the ether. So, as I keep saying, increased inequality entrenches privilege and causes social dislocation. Anybody with even a cursory examination of the historical record of this planet will tell you over and over and over again, increasing inequality entrenches privilege in the hands of fewer and fewer people and creates a situation where violence becomes part of the political process. Because people think there is no other way. In many situations, there is no other way. Think about it. Because ultimately, the type of story we tell is our business. How we tell it is our business. We shouldn't be constrained by the corporate-owned media, we shouldn't censor ourselves because something we're going to say may be unpopular, right? May not win us brownie points or adulation or votes if you're involved in parliamentary politics. But the fact is, change only comes when ideas are expanded, when they're put into the mix. When you have the same ideas day in and day out, all you get is an ossification of society. You tend to, it tends to be Groundhog Day. Every day is the same. And no problems are ever resolved. So let's look at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Now, we are told that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is a publicly owned company. Well, it's not on the stock market, but we own it, the Australian people, because we finance it. We give them $1 billion a year, all right? The Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is now, pretty old, been around a long time. Now, it's fascinating what's been happening in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm not even talking about current court cases in the last 30 years. Fascinating. I remember in the 70s, especially, it was pretty easy to get a gig on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation if you had some ideas that you wished to discuss. Today, activism is a dirty word. Listening to Ita Buttrose give her evidence at a particular case that's going on at the minute, Latouche case, she said she was an activist. As if being an activist is some type of sin, some type of pornographic disgust. An activist. So is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation impartial? And if it's not impartial, why is it not impartial? Well, when it comes to war criminals, and I'm talking about Netanyahu and Putin, both have been sectioned by International Criminal Court for war crimes, okay. We have good war criminals and we have bad war criminals. And obviously Putin is a bad war criminal, and we don't want to, be impartial as far as he is concerned and his government is concerned in what they're doing in the Ukraine. That is bad, bad, bad. It's an invasion, all right? And now Netanyahu and his cabinet and his government and the majority of the Israeli people have been guilty of crimes against humanity. But they're good war criminals. You can't say anything against them, especially when you get the, Bufalini welcoming Netanyahu into the United States of America as some type of hero. And when you get Bufalini talking about clearing the bloody Palestinians out of Gaza and setting up a nice resort on the, the Middle Eastern Riviera, you begin to think, where's this bloke coming from? But that's a different story. But do we actually have any capacity, does the Australian Broadcasting Corporation has any capacity to present a different analysis or a different idea? The fact is, it doesn't, and it's not its fault. It's not the fault of the presenters who are, basically honest, decent people trying to do a job in a particularly difficult situation. When you have a board which is stacked with people who would like to see the privatisation of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, when you've got a whole host of middle management, as we're seeing during the current court case, who will do anything to ensure there is no diversity of opinion on the Australian of any consequence on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And then we have the pressure that's applied to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation by outside elements who are concerned, one, that's the corporate-owned media, about eating into their profitability, because every person who tunes into the Australian Broadcasting Corporation or listens to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is lost as a potential eye on their crappy advertisements. So there's this constant pressure, especially from the Murdoch-led media, who are totally responsible for creating the situation in the United States of America, which saw the rise and rise and rise of Buffalini. And at the same time, we have these external organisations applying pressure, political pressure, on the board, which is weak as water, and on middle management, who are basically interested in, maintaining their jobs, which is understandable. Constant pressure. Constant pressure. So it's one thing to talk about the government guild at ABC. It's another thing to talk about why it finds itself in this situation. Look at the current court case about somebody who's put on for 5 bloody mornings or something and chucked out after 3 episodes because, a lobby, the Jewish lobby, didn't like her. End of story. Unbelievable. That's the way it goes. So that's why I'm saying to you, community radio is important. The Anarchist World this week is important. Your support for Community Radio 3CR is critical, essential. Now, we are not impartial. We don't sit on the fence. We take sides. But how do we take sides? Not because of some national rhetoric or, we take sides of people who find themselves oppressed and marginalised. People who should be eating from a table laden with goodies in this country, but find themselves living extraordinarily difficult lives, like the 3/4 of old age pensioners who are forced to rent, who are living in poverty, the 1.5 million children that are living in poverty, the majority of Australians who live a hand-to-mouth existence trying to pay their bills and find it difficult to survive, despite 2 of them working in any household. That's what we're interested in. We're not impartial. We're quite happy to say we're not impartial. But we don't support the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. We don't support their political allies who ensure they continue to remain in power by trying to change the message in the community about how wonderful and kind and inclusive their policies are. I have no interest whatsoever in looking at somebody's physical characteristics because they're in a position of authority and making fun of that. But I am interested in their ideas, the policies they're pursuing. Do the policies they're pursuing concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands? Do the policies they're pursuing and articulating concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands? And that's what you need to ask yourself. Because it's all very well to say, that bloke's got no hair and he's a potato head. But that's irrelevant, totally irrelevant in the discussion. What is relevant is the hatred and division and carnage they're causing in the community in their drive for power. That's what's important. So think about it. The thing is, sometimes you may think to yourself, well, what's the point? What's the point? You can't fight City Hall. Why don't I take up a hobby? Maybe I'll collect cigarette lighters. Maybe I'll become a cyber activist, keyboard warrior. Maybe I'll throw a rock through my television set and grow vegetables. You know, and that's what they want. See, cynicism is the lifeblood of those who exercise power. For us to be cynical about the institutions that exist is positive. But for us as activists to be cynical about the possibility of change is self-defeating. Because what it does, it takes you out of the equation for change. You've been tucked away. You've become part of the silent majority. You know, we'll continue to pass legislation to put your kids' future in jeopardy. We know that you will not get up and say anything. We know that because you are part of the silent majority. And that's the problem, isn't it? You see, I know I keep saying this every week and it's a bit boring, but it's real. Democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. By an engaged public. And if we disengage from the political process, whether parliamentary or extra-parliamentary, I mean, the political process is not just a matter of casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years. It's much, much, much more than that. It's about remaining active in between election campaigns. So, talk is cheap. I know you're telling me, Joe, talk is cheap. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do during the next federal election? You're going to sit back in your armchair and be an armchair critic, telling us all the things that are wrong in society? Are you going to jump up and down? Are you going to become cynical, and think you can't fight City Hall? Or I'm going to put my feet in the water. And I've decided to put my feet in the water. Whether I succeed or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that we begin to discuss ideas that could have a profoundly positive impact on Australian society, ideas I've spoken about on this program in the past. Things like a 1%, stock market tax. And the list goes on and on. I'm not talking about revolution or blood in the streets. I'm talking about simple parliamentary reform to make this a more equal community. As I keep saying, economic inequality equals entrenched privilege, equals social dislocation. And when I talk about social dislocation, I'm not just talking about riots and, petitions and all the things in between. I'm talking about the social dislocation that occurs in society when one group is pitted against another. The social dislocation which is caused by the divide and rule mentality, which is becoming such an integral feature of Australian life today. The social dislocation caused when people think that change is impossible. They think it's all their fault. And they go on that odyssey, that journey, which leads to addiction and self-destruction because they see no future for them or their children. That's the social dislocation I'm talking about. The social dislocation which means that we lose all hope. Hope, the love child, desire and expectation. The desire for change and the expectation that change will occur. So I'm going to put my feet in the water. I'll get my feet wet, lose a bit of money, but it'll be worth the effort. Currently, I'm toying with the idea of standing as a candidate in the federal election in the electorate of Flinders in Victoria. A very nice part of Victoria. Blue ribbon Liberal seat. With a few policies to shake up the debate in that area. Now, I'm not going to be elected. And all the people involved in the campaign will at least be able to pat themselves on the back, and at the end of the campaign will say, well, I did something. I tried my best. And I encourage other people listening to this program who are interested in following this particular issue to go to my Facebook page, Joseph Toscano, have a look at what I'm doing, and maybe you could emulate, follow the same strategy across the country. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had 151 radical independents standing in every federal electoral seat? Not that we expect one to be elected, but maybe we could make movement in the debate about Australians having to rely on the crumbs being brushed off the corporate table. Nice slogan. Never again will Australians have to rely on the crumbs brushed off the corporate table, because that's what we do today. We rely on those crumbs. But the trouble is, the crumbs are not enough. And we're fighting amongst ourselves for the crumbs. We forget there's a table and we need to saw off that leg so the cake falls off the table and there's cake for everyone. But that's an old analogy, isn't it? Because you see, you've got to remember, and this is the dilemma in this country, you need to remember that everything we take for granted, the introduction of a universal healthcare system, Medicare, initially called Medibank, the introduction and expansion of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, the introduction of public education, the introduction of a minimum wage, the introduction of holiday pay, sick pay, protections in law, which is obviously very hard to access if you haven't got the amount of money, legal aid, and the list goes on and on. Everything which makes life bearable has come through struggle. People ask me, why was Churchill voted out after World War II when he did so much for the British Empire? The fact is very simple. People in Britain and the rest of the world saw millions of people being sacrificed on the altar of war, and they expected something for that sacrifice at the end of World War II. And it's the same today. Will it be more of the same, day in and day out, week in and week out? Is it going to be more of the same inane debates about nothing in particular? Or are things going to change? As I said before, cynicism is the aphrodisiac of the ruling classes. Cynicism is a sin. You like that? It's a sin against your very essence. We are positive in our makeup. And as human beings, we have cooperated, we've survived, we've prospered. We are at a crossroads. What direction you take is up to you, but ultimately, change comes from an engaged public. So I'm encouraging you to become engaged, whether it's at parliamentary level, extra parliamentary level, as an activist, as an individual, as a member of a group. Engagement is the important thing that we need to remember. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast, 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. And yes, I do check the post office box. And you can write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, JosephToscano.nam, and the list goes on and on and on. Listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. Bye-bye, boys and girls. Bye-bye. The sacred cows have come in again. They've just subscribed to 3CR.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You might have heard about the Community Radio Plus app, but it's only when you start using it that you'll wonder how you lived without it.
You can listen to us wherever you are, at home, work, driving.
On public transport, gardening, protesting, or even in the bath.
Just search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.